By 1949, if we think about the example of Germany, what we see is really the hardening of those lines which have begun to appear, those divisions that have begun to appear as early as the latter years of World War II and have since grown over the course of the late 1940s. We see this most prominently in Germany, in that German example, following the Berlin blockade and airlift, in the creation of two distinct political entities, not zones of occupation any longer, but essentially two separate nations, or certainly political nations, with their own boundaries. On the west, of course, West Germany, and on the east, East Germany. But we also see the hardening of these divisions, the hardening of the lines that separate East from West and Soviets from the U.S. and its allies. We see that in the creation in April of 1949 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is known as NATO. This is a mutual defense organization in which the various partners or member states agree to come to the aid of any other member state when that member state is attacked. So that if Germany is invaded, or if something else were to happen to one of the members of NATO, the other members would have a distinct obligation under the agreement to come to the aid of that member in distress. If I remember correctly, and I'm just kind of mentioning this one in passing, I think the only time that particular clause of the NATO agreement was enacted was following the attacks on September 11th in New York City, when the United States was, of course, attacked by an unknown at that time foreign entity. Didn't happen really during the Cold War, but the fact you would feel the need for the development of these kind of security organizations, and more would follow, of course, suggests the hardening taking place, the building of institutions, not merely West Germany, but specific institutions of an international nature that ally certain nations with one another in opposition to other nations. And in fact, in 1955, the Soviets would follow suit in creating their own mutual defense organization known as the Warsaw Pact, which involved Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, and the Soviet Union. So already by 49, the divisions are being marked out quite clearly. But I'd also like to suggest that 1949 was a year of considerable change in the relationships that had existed since the Second World War. Events occurred which really called into question the sort of continuity of events and opened the door for an entirely new relationship among the opponent or the opposing parties. It's kind of hard to say. In August of 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its own atomic weapon. You know and I know, and I think you would clearly understand, that's just a game changer. Through the late 1940s, really, the United States has been the sole owner of the technology and ability to deliver a nuclear weapon around the globe. There was no one else. We possessed, the U.S. possessed that power unilaterally. After August of 49, and the U.S. becomes aware of the successful test of an atomic weapon in the Soviet Union, really, I think it was September the 3rd, early September of 1949. From that point forward, the U.S. will have to recognize that the potential for destruction of the globe just went up. Now, granted, the Soviet Union may not have sufficient bombs, along with the U.S. may not have sufficient bombs to actually pursue global destruction or even think about it. But once you have two opponents, clearly they're opponents by 49, once you have two opponents, both with the technology to build the bombs that would destroy the Earth, you really are talking about an entirely new epoch in human history. Sure, we've had the capacity all along to destroy each other, to destroy our opposing group, even another nation perhaps. But the use of atomic weapons on a massive scale, that's different. And that's part of what gives the Cold War its fearful aspect. It's not just another war. It's not just the Soviet Union versus the United States, but it is the prospect of worldwide destruction to the point of potential extinction. And that power being possessed, first of all, by human beings, and then by human beings who don't like one another. That's something entirely different. Anyway, I kind of hope that little bit helps you understand the fear that was just part of life during the Cold War. But there was another event in 1949 that also had implications for the relationships of the Cold War, and that was in 1949 the success or the victory of Chinese communist forces in China. These forces had been fighting since before the Second World War, led by Mao Zedong, for control of the Chinese mainland. And they had been fighting nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, which were supported by the United States. Well, in 1949, the Chinese nationalists were driven from the mainland and basically took up life on the island of Formosa or Taiwan. On the mainland, Mao and the communists declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. It was a nation that basically the United States refused to recognize. In fact, the United Nations refused to recognize for a considerable time afterward. And while that may be so, the People's Republic of China was a reality. The United States couldn't really help but see that as another example of communists, perhaps even Soviet aggression, of a communist world bent on further expansion and being quite successful at it. But the United States doesn't overtly respond to the Chinese communist success in 1949. Rather, it will be an event nearby that provokes a direct U.S. response. In 1950, most likely with some approval from the Soviet Union, North Korean troops will invade South Korea. After the war and after the Japanese defeat, once the Korean peninsula had been liberated from the Japanese, the peninsula was divided along an east-west line, the 38th parallel, so that there was a northern sector and a southern sector of Korea. The northern sector tended to be sympathetic to the Soviet Union, to China, and to communism. The southern sector tended to be sympathetic to the West and to the United States. Well, the invasion in 1950 by North Korean troops will push South Korean troops and some U.S. troops really back into, U.S. troops that had been sent to help defend Korea, back into a very small pocket at the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. It came to be known as the Pusan Perimeter. It's kind of like a last stand, if you will. And American troops who were part of this are in danger, ultimately, of being driven into the sea. And then there's the danger for Harry Truman and for American foreign policy experts of a complete North Korean victory. The response by the United States is a rapid move to get the United Nations involved. Remember, the United Nations had been created as a body to help deal with aggression before it led to outright war. And so, though the Soviet Union and the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations did not have an active say in this vote for a number of different reasons, the United Nations and the Security Council, these are the leaders, the major powers. Okay, that's part of the deal for creation of the UN, that there would be a Security Council. The Soviet Union's not there to vote no. They move quickly to send troops, UN troops, to support the South Korean and U.S. troops already in South Korea, who are now stuck in this small toehold at the bottom or the south end of the Korean Peninsula. The result will be a drive northward, pushing the North Korean troops back. There will also be, under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, our old friend from the Philippines in World War II, there will also be a major amphibious landing by UN troops, mainly the U.S., at Incheon on the western coast of the South Korean peninsula. This invasion, because it happens really behind North Korean lines, will force the North Korean military forces to fall back northward into North Korea, across the 38th parallel, and here the United States continues the push. The UN continues the push northward until they near North Korea's northern border with China. Once they do, by late 1950, Chinese troops by the hundreds of thousands pour across the border with North Korea, begin driving UN forces back southward now, pushing them southward down the Korean Peninsula. And the retreat it's just an amazing story. Pockets of American resistance left behind. It's just sometimes a full-fledged retreat, sometimes a fighting retreat. But the numbers of Chinese forces are just overwhelming to the number of forces there for the U.S. and the UN. By the time it sort of stalemated, North Korean and Chinese forces have driven the UN forces back to a line that's located near the 38th parallel. It's not exactly the straight line of the 38th parallel. It reflects, where the battle had pushed the various forces, but it's right along the 38th parallel. And what ultimately follows will be a stalemate. 1951 all the way to 1953, when a final truce is signed. To this day, the United States has troops stationed, U.S. troops stationed in Korea. It is one of those long-standing remnants of the Cold War, a long-standing remnant of a way of seeing the world, of an opposition that grew out of the Second World War. When we move on to the next segment about the Cold War, we'll be talking about what I consider sort of the height of the Cold War as we move through the 1950s and on to the 1960s, setting the stage for Vietnam, American involvement in Vietnam in a big way, and by the 1970s, what we refer to as détente, some of the first real successful efforts to begin reductions of the number of nuclear arms that we and the Soviets had aimed at one another. So we'll pick up there later.